you'll learn the skills that would empower life. Today, we're going to learn how to make a lady's jacket. Yes, something close to being a suit, but we're not going to observe all the rules in making a suit, but we're going to learn how to make a lady's jacket. Let's go to the board and see how it looks like. So here on the board, we have our jacket. That's how it looks like. It's a lady's jacket. We have some little styling here with the buttons on top of it and short sleeves. That's how it's going to look like after we finish making it. And on this side of the board, you can see that we have our front pattern here. Just like we did for our simple blouse with princess cuts, we're going to have a front pattern, a back pattern. So this is our front pattern, after which we will now make the back pattern. So let's consider the measurements we'll use for this lady's jacket. Screen that. Very well. Okay, and after I've marked out my lapel edge, I'll mark out my buttonhole allowance, which is very important. That will be 1 inch. After I've marked out my lapel edge and my buttonhole allowance, I'll now begin to mark out my measurements. So my shoulder, I divide that into 2. That will give me 7 1/4. So I measure 7 1/4 here. And I immediately measure out my neckline width, which is 2 3/4. Just like making a shirt, so it should be close to the neck. I now mark out my shoulder slant, which is 1.5 inches. Slant that to that point there. Now draw this line down on my armhole. My armhole depth is 7.5 inches, so I'm using 7.5 inches for my armhole depth. I'll mark that out here and draw the line through that point. On that line, we'll measure out our bust measurement. Our bust measurement is 9.5 inches. That's 9.5 inches there. So now, for the length of this, now remember that we're making a lady's jacket and we're trying to observe some of the rules of making a suit, but not necessarily all the rules. So one of the things that we're going to observe here is the position of the dent. Now the position of the dent is not going to be the midpoint as usual. It's going to be 2/3 of the way. That means we're going to divide our armhole depth into 2 and use 2 points of that, 2 parts of that. That means that this is 7.5 inches. I divide that into 3. That will give me 2.5. I now multiply that by 2. That will give me 5. So 5 inches is 2/3 of 7.5 inches. So I'll mark 5 inches down somewhere here. And then I would mark out my dent. This one around my dent is going to go inward much more than the normal 1 inch we use. We're going to make it 1.5 inches. For the suit, normally it's deeper than that, but we're going to use 1.5 inches. So we'll use 1.5 inches. That will come in here. So let's remove that. This is 5. So I now use my ruler to mark it down to that point there. Then of course, from there I now curve. You can see that it's deeper, it's set in properly because we need to take off all the excess as much as possible and make our suit sit well. All right? So after I've done that, I'll measure out my shoulder to bust. My shoulder to bust is 11.5 inches. That should be somewhere here. On that line, you replicate the 9.5 inches for the bust. Draw the line down that way. On this bust line, we will now measure out our bust span, that is 3.5 inches, somewhere here. So from this point here where we have our dent, we now curve it down to that point. You can see that. Good. Then immediately I draw out my line here. Now, this is the dent. I can use as much as 2 inches or 2.5 inches. Because I want it to sit well, I'll use 2.5 inches for my dent. This is where it will be here. 2.5 inches is fine. So I now curve it back to that point. You can see that? I'll now measure this point here, this curve that is here. I replicate the same measurement somewhere here. Let's assume it's here. Measure out my 1 inch downwards. That's 1 inch there. I'll now curve it to that point. Because, we're going to close this back off, so we want it to, have enough space so that it can come back to our original 7 inches for our armhole depth. So I take this all the way down, my 3.5 inches. This is 3.5 inches. And I measure my shoulder to waist and the length of the blouse. Shoulder to waist is 16 inches. I measure that out somewhere here. And the length of the blouse, we didn't put that there, the length. For the length, we'll use 24 inches. So we'll measure that down here, from here to here, that's 24 inches. So on this length, we'll now come back here to the middle, mark out our darts here, half and half. You just take that there, and you take this here, and you come back here and take it all the way down. Then we now come back to the waist. Now that what I'm left here with is 3 inches, so the waist is 8.5 inches. If I subtract 3 inches from that, I'll have 5.5 inches left. So I have 5.5 inches here. You can see that. Now look at this. We have 3 here, we have 5.5, that's 8.5 inches. Obviously by the time you're done, this will just be like a straight line. So it's somewhere here. That's what happens when you have a big stomach like mine. So you find that you don't really have so much of a shape on your pattern, but it doesn't matter. By the time we take out the darts and we sew it together, we'll see the shape come out. So at the base here, I'll measure out the hips. The hips is 10.5 inches. That should be somewhere here. This is from here. This is my 10.5 inches. I now curve that, 10.5. I curve that to that place there. Good. So we can see that we've already done that. It's going to have a straight edge at that point there. Now come back to my lapel, my collar region. Now, I want my lapel to end at my waistline. So what I would do would be that I would take the measurement of my shoulder to waist, which is 16 inches. I'll divide that into 3. Now, obviously, because this is 16 inches, it might be like 15 1/4 thereabout. Let's just take, it will be like 5 1/4. So I'll just take 5 inches as 1/3 of my distance. That's the shoulder to waist. That's the distance that I want my lapel to end. But if I want my lapel to end shorter than that, all I just need to do is, if I want it to be, for instance, 9 inches, I want my lapel to fold out up to 9 inches, I just divide that into 3, take 1/3, and I use it. That's how it works. So because my waist is 16 inches, I will divide that into 3. I'll just approximately use 5 inches for that. So I come here to the top here, measure out 5 inches, and I come here and curve it to that point there. You can see that? This is 5 inches. I come to this point that where my waist is on the buttonhole allowance. Now don't forget that the buttonhole allowance is part of your pattern. What is not totally part of everything is your lapel edge. So we'll curve from the lapel edge here to where the waistline is on the buttonhole. So I just curve there. I just come down like about 2 inches down and curve it from there. I want it to move to have a very nice curve to that point here. So we're done with our front pattern. Let's take a look at our back pattern. So the first thing we're going to do on our back pattern will be to measure out our shoulder measurement directly. That's our shoulder measurement. That's 7 1/4. Our neckline width is 2 3/4 inches. So I'll mark that out there. Come here, measure my 1.5 inches. And connect that there. My neckline depth for the back will be 1/2 inch because it's just like I'm going to make a collar, so I don't need it to be too deep. So I'm using 1/2 inch. That's 1/2 inch, and then we curve it up to the top like that. Good. So now we want to work out our armhole. My armhole is 7.5 inches. That's what I'm using. So I mark out 7.5 inches here. Draw the line through that point. On that line, I measure out my bust. My bust is 9.5 inches. I get the midpoint. This time around, I'm going to use a midpoint. That means that I'm going to use 3 3/4. And I mark inward 1/2 inch for my dent. Now connect it there and curve it there. Good. So I now measure out my shoulder to bust, shoulder to waist, and the length of the blouse. My shoulder to bust is here. Shoulder to bust is 11.5. Waist. Now for the waist, we are going to reduce the waist for the back by 1/2 inch. Now you'll notice that the back is slightly shorter than the front. So for a jacket, it's very important that we take note of that. So we're going to subtract 1/2 inch from our shoulder to waist for the back. And that will give us 15.5 inches. So I now measure the length of my blouse. The length of my blouse is 24 inches. So this is where it is. 24. That's where the measurement is. So I now replicate this measurement on my bust line here. Draw the line. Then remember how it is on our simple blouse. We come to the armhole line here. We divide it exactly into 2 because there's no bust at the back. So we're going to divide that exactly into 2. And what we're going to have is 4 3/4 because this is 9.5. So we're going to have exactly 4 3/4 here. That's 4 3/4. And then you just curve it there to that point. And you draw the line all the way down. Good. So once I've done that, I come to this point here. Now because of the curve of the back, I told you that this is a ladies' jacket, so we're going to be observing some of the rules of making a suit. I'll come here to the exact middle here, the center back here, and I would take in 3/4 inch. Just 3/4 inch. It's also like a dart. It's just for it to take, to curve around the back of the jacket. I'll now come here, 4 inches down here, 4 inches, and I'll now take my ruler and draw that down to where, don't mind my my strokes there. Just take it down to that point. When we get to the pattern paper, it will be straight. Okay? After I've done that, I now take it back to the base here. You can see that that's like a very big dart. You can see that? So once I've done that, what I'm left with here is 4 inches, but I'm still going to take some darts here. I'll take 1/4 inch on both sides. Rather than taking 1/2 inch, I'll take 1/4 inch here, 1/4 here, and 1/4 there. I slant it from the top here with my ruler. Slant it there. Okay, so now what we're left with here is 3 3/4, because this is a 3/4 here, this is a 1/4 here, and what's left here is 3 3/4. Now, I want to balance up my waist here. So this is it. I'm going to subtract 3 3/4 from 8. And what I would have left should be 4 3/4. That's 3 plus 4. 3 plus 4 is 7. 3/4 plus 3/4 is 1.5. So that means I get my 8.5 inches. So I'm going to have 4 3/4 here. I'll now mark out that position there and connect it down. And I'll measure out my hip measurement, which is 10.5 inches. Somewhere here, and I'll curve it out. So that's my back pattern. So let's take a look at how we're going to make the sleeves. We have here our sleeve length is 8.5 inches, and our sleeve width is 6.5 inches. The armhole depth we're using is 7.5 inches. Now, because of the way we're going to fit in the sleeve, we're going to ease it in. That means we're going to have a slight gather at the top of the sleeve. Very slight, you wouldn't even notice it. So we're going to add an extra inch. Instead of adding half an inch, we're going to add an extra inch as the seam allowance, because we're incorporating the easing in off the crown of the sleeve. So instead of using 7.5 plus half, we're going to make it 7.5 plus 1. So I'll take that here. I'll draw my rectangle. So I come here, measure out my armhole depth. I add 1 inch here. That will give me 8.5 inches. This is where it is. I draw the line. Measure out the length of my sleeve. The length of my sleeve is 8.5 inches. You can see it's a square now. It's 8.5. Draw the line down. Good. So after I've done that, I now mark out my sleeve boxes. I'm going to be using 3 inches each for my sleeve boxes, because now I want my sleeve to fit very well along my armhole. So I'll measure out 3 inches here and 3 inches here. Take it down. And I'll get the midpoint here. So I label A, B, C, and D. So I curve from here to the intersection here, and I curve here. Yeah. So that's my sleeve. And I'll get to this point now, measure out my sleeve width. My sleeve width is 6.5 inches. So that's the sleeve. We've already gotten our sleeve now. So now that we have done all our patterns and we've illustrated them, we'll now go to the table and now begin to draft our patterns.